Outerversal power scaling, explained and defined. Hello everyone, welcome in today's video. Now, if you're a fan of this channel, it's very likely you've encountered a conversation a bit like this, where you ask, do you like my reasoning for someone being outerversal? And in response, a popular power scaling wiki will very much like to say, your character isn't outerversal because of our wiki standards. And no, I'm not just picking on character stats and profile versus battle wiki. All the power scaling wikis will say this, and quite often they'll moan at each other saying one wiki standards doesn't match another wiki standards. So in this video, I want to break that down completely. We're going to remove the idea of there being only certain ways you can reach outerversal, and instead talk about the very fundamentals of what outerversal is, and then I'll start naming different ways you can reach outerversal in a universally accepted way. That way that we don't have any misconceptions on what is outerversal, as well as there are many different common ways you can reach outerversal itself. What this video covers in order. Why do we even have outerversal in the first place? What is the basic conditions to create an outerversal scale? Every common outerversal scaling method I have seen, as well as the outerversal scaling methods I have used on this channel before. Disclaimer. As we go to more and more unique ideas to scale to outerversal, expect the idea to get progressively more complicated. Furthermore, to make this video as user-friendly as possible for those more complicated methods, I will be summarizing how those methods work. Lastly, remember this is a power scaling video, so therefore all the ideas I will be mentioning, no matter how complicated, will be in the context of power scaling. Therefore, don't expect them to be the same as what you might read straight out of the textbook, because it's not generalized, it's for power scaling. Why do we even have outerversal power scaling in the first place? In power scaling, it became a common thing at some point that characters could scale beyond the boundaries of a universe. And this is not just the observable universe, but the very commonly fictionally portrayed infinite universe. That meant we couldn't just stack more finite energy levels to a universal character, as we had already reached infinity. We needed some way to go past that, and how we got past that was through an already real-life existing solution that was higher dimensionality. Using a higher dimensional framework, we would say something along the lines of a 4D ant being stronger than an infinite 3D universe. And because we could scale up these dimensionalities numerically, we could then say that if a 4D ant exists, there exists an infinite 4D universe, and an infinite 4D universe is still weaker than a 5th dimensional ant. And that 5th dimensional ant exists in an infinite 5D universe, which is still smaller than an 6th dimensional ant, and so on. This brings up to a new natural limit that was beyond universes and at the dimensionality limit, high hyperversal, which is infinite dimensionality. Some characters though, especially in ones that brought up outerversal in the first place, that being H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, they would go even further than high hyperversal very clearly. So how do we go past high hyperversal? We needed a new tier for these high tier characters. Something that would non-primitively surpass infinite dimensionality in the same way that dimensionality surpassed infinite 3D finite energy. That is exactly why outerversal power scaling was introduced. What is the basic conditions to create an outerversal scale? This may seem like a pointless question because we're going to go over examples that already exist, but it is also important to look out what we should be looking for in a correct scale if you want to create your own. Remember what I said earlier, we want to non-primitively surpass high hyperversal. When I say non-primitively, we need to surpass high hyperversal in a way that we aren't just repeating what already exists. If we have high hyperversal and we want to upscale, we're saying someone had 10 more joules, the energy of a light bulb or something, we're not really saying they've gotten any stronger, they're still high hyperversal. If we say they were 10 times stronger, they got some sort of Kaioken times 10 when already being high hyperversal, they're 10 times stronger, they're still high hyperversal, they've not exited infinite dimensionality. Now you could say, what if we stack another higher dimension on top? At high hyperversal, they're already infinite dimensionality. Being infinity plus 1 dimensionality doesn't quite sound like they're going outside of dimensionality into something greater. It sounds like we're still stuck in the framework of dimensional scaling when we're trying to go higher. We need something that will separate us from high hyperversal in a non-primitive way. To do this, we need something new and innovated that would be able to be non-primitive compared to what already exists. We want something to scale without using dimensionality, without using energy, without using other things. Every common outerversal scaling meta I have seen. First, conceptual transcendences. A conceptual transcendence is the introduction of a new axiom of scaling, just like how dimensional tiering introduced the axiom of surpassing an infinite universe. This is arguably the original form of outerversal, heavily popularized by Versus Battle Wiki back in the day, and is still one of the most common methods used today. It starts with a shift of perspective. In dimensional scaling, we are comparing things based on space and time, spatial or temporal dimensions. But when it happens to be using space and time as a tool to comparison, we can then link the very concepts of space and time itself. If we do such, no matter how many dimensions you're dealing with, 3D, 4D, infinite dimensional, they all appear equally limited when compared to the metaphysical concept of space, and the same for the temporal dimension of time. And if you can transcend that concept of space and time, you are no longer bound to dimensional scaling. You are leaving the framework entirely. That is where the original idea of outerversal power scaling came from. Characters not bound by space or time, but instead being far above it, above these very concepts. Later, people started extending this scaling to most famously include something like Platonic concepts, something I've discussed on the channel before in one of my most popular videos. Using Plato's cave analogy, we have the settling image of the physical world, which is meant to be already an infinite dimensional high hyperversal realm, and this physical world is meant to be in Plato's cave the non-existent shadow on the wall. Meanwhile, the physical in the cave analogy, which is considered the real, that is not the shadow, but the light and the people around who are observing it. Considering that the shadow is the absence of existence, it means that all of things we're talking about within dimensional scaling, high hyperversal, infinite dimensionality, that's all bound to the shadow, non-existence. Meanwhile, everything that does exist, the physical characters and the light, are beyond that. And because they are beyond that in a way that cannot be reached, because they actually do exist, it makes them outerversal, something that cannot be reached by stacking dimensionality. So if a character transcends this concept, it should also be outerversal. This then could be extended to say that really, if you think about it, almost all concepts in a way are beyond things like space, time, physical, temporal. The concept of a chair. A chair is something that could be abstract in its concept in a way that it's not bound by dimensionality, because a fifth dimensional chair and infinite dimensional chair are all just chairs, while the concept of such would far surpass it. So the concept of a chair should be beyond infinite dimensionality in a way that it cannot be reached by stacking dimensions. But can we then say that, therefore, all concepts are outerversal? Well, there are two little caveats that make this implausible. The first caveat is that not all concepts are truly outerversal. In fiction, they often have a character who is an embodiment of a concept. However, embodiments of a concept can be problematic. If you embody something like the concept of space, concept of time, of course you're still outerversal. But if you have a localized concept, like you embody a nightmare, or you embody a dream, or you embody someone's willpower, these sort of ideas are actually limited to the scope of an individual. If someone's nightmare is limited to only show a universe, that nightmare cannot be outerversal, even though you embody the conceptualization of it. If someone's willpower is limited to only destroying a building, then that means their conceptual willpower is limited to only building level, because that's all it embodies. A good example of this would be something like Freddy Krueger, with him embodying the nightmares in his realm, or you could look at someone like Kara from Undertale, who embodies determination, but it still isn't an outerversal entity because determination is limited. With that, we can say that a localization of an embodiment isn't outerversal without the correct context, or they embody a concept that's already outerversal itself. The second problem when it comes to saying that concepts are outerversal is they can actually go higher. In some other videos with Marvel, I've mentioned characters who scale to the concept of concepts. The concept of concepts is like saying the concepts of outerversal or the outerversal of the outerversal, which in power scaling terms that would be high outerversal and scales much higher. Furthermore, it doesn't even have to be stacking of concepts, because I'm going to then mention other different scaling methods that you can get to outerversal. The next one is going to be a narrative transcendence, meaning if you're the concept of a narrative, you are already high outerversal and we haven't even stacked concepts. That's just a baseline concept. So with that, those are the two caveats when it comes to saying all concepts are outerversal, because some of them are lower and many of them are in fact higher. Now for the second common version of scaling to outerversal that many different fictional wikis use. This new one is what many people call the real over fiction transcendence. You might say it as R over F, but I'm just going to call it the narrative transcendence because it makes much more sense. A narrative transcendence is much like the conceptual one, but we are introducing a new axiom. And this new axiom of scaling is that of narratives, the plot itself, the story, as opposed to a concept. So this uses the same sort of idea that a conceptual transcendence would use. In this version, instead of saying that we embody something like space or time or some abstract metaphysicality of something that exists physically, what we are instead doing is using something that is meta in the sense of it is beyond what exists within the story itself. So characters who view other characters within the fictional story as fiction, and there's that gap of they can see the story and those in the story cannot. In reality, this type of transcendence is very much mirroring the same argumentation that Plato's cave is using. You see, those who have a narrative transcendence over another character view them as only fiction, and fiction in reality just doesn't exist. So even if that fiction was to have an infinite dimensional realm, high hyperversal, and an infinite number of these universes, it all equally doesn't exist, the same as just a rock doesn't. Because of such, you can say that a narrative transcendence is beyond any dimensionality in a way that cannot be reached using the lower tiers. You have to stack a narrative transcendence to reach it. This is the exact same argumentation as the Plato cave for Platonic concepts, and therefore it can also reach outerversal. However, unlike the concepts one, it uses a completely new framework, as narratives, while a meta concept, are not one that exists as a concept itself. Hence, the concept of a narrative, or the narrative story of a concept, are two different things, and both of which would be high outerversal with this logic. But just like conceptual transcendences, there are caveats. The first one, and probably the biggest problem with when narrative real over fiction transcendences were introduced, is that just because a character has a plot-based, narrative-altering ability, it doesn't actually mean they are a fictional level above another character. You can have characters who can know what the story is, be able to change some events in the story, but in reality they still exist within the story. And because they still exist within the story and they're just manipulating parts within it, they end up actually not having a narrative transcendence. I am planning to do a video going over whether or not plot powers or narrative powers are an exaggeration, or if they're overrated, or if they're just misunderstood. And in that video I will clarify a lot of this. Also, another problem is a real within fiction transcendence may be deceiving within the fictional verse itself. A good example of this is to imagine if a comic book character is reading a comic book of another character, and then the character in the comic book comes out and says hello. Have they done a narrative transcendence where they've gone from fiction to real, Or have they simply been a two-dimensional character on a piece of paper with a, let's say, two-dimensional time stream compared to like a three-dimensional one, and they've just realized that there's an extra dimension and been able to pop out? That insecurity on whether or no it's a dimensional boost or whether or not it's a narrative boost makes it harder to justify than something like conceptual transcendences. However, because narrative scaling is separate to conceptual transcendences, both these should be counted when looking at outerversal scaling. Now for the third one, and it is the current scaling method for outerversal on character stats and profile, beyond dimensional scaling. Now, beyond dimensional scaling, in a way, takes the ideas that I've been saying arbitrarily when I was talking about conceptual transcendences and narrative transcendences, and what they're doing is saying, well, basically, in both ideas, we are just transcending dimensionality itself. If you transcend dimensionality, you cannot reach it with dimensions. Therefore, you should be outerversal. Nice and simple. But it's problematic, and the biggest problem is justifying what transcending dimensionality is. The first bit is ambiguity. Let's say a character has a statement of being beyond all dimensions. That statement is very limited to whatever context is currently being shown. If a fictional verse is limited to string theory and only has something like 11 dimensions, then being beyond all dimensions could literally mean they're just a 12th dimensional character, which is just a primitive transcendence. It's not something that is reaching outerversal in any way. Another thing is, if we have a character who is infinite dimensional and another character is beyond all dimensions, is that character infinite plus one dimensions, or are they beyond any type of dimensionality because someone who's infinite dimensional exists? This sort of clarity doesn't really exist when you say someone who's just beyond all dimensions. We need something a lot more direct when saying someone is beyond dimensionality, saying like they're not bound by dimensions or something like that. Another problem is the statistical vagueness that may come when looking at different wikis. So we have said so far that if a character is beyond dimensionality, they are outerversal. That's concrete. However, we've also mentioned different definitions such as conceptual transcendences and narrative transcendences, which also go beyond dimensionality. So some would say, well, if you can mention a person is a conceptual transcendence beyond dimensionality or narrative transcendence beyond dimensionality, they have achieved the condition of being beyond dimensionality. However, those scaling methods have a problem, because not everyone will agree with it. Some people don't agree with narrative scaling being beyond dimensionality, even though it is. Some people don't agree with conceptual transcendences being beyond dimensionality, even though it is. And because of that ambiguity with different wikis, the definition seems even more vague when in reality it's quite clear. So those are the two problems that come with beyond dimensional scaling. Now let's talk about the fourth and most recent thing people are using for scaling to outerversal, quantitative superiority. Now in the previous ones, when I talked about conceptual transcendences, narrative transcendences, as well as just being beyond dimensionality, the main common theme outside of being beyond dimensionality is that you are introducing something new that exists outside of dimensionality so that you can then start the scaling chain again. You have a new axiom to scale off. However, quantitative superiority doesn't do that. Instead, it uses the theory that when someone is bound to dimensionality, they are one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, all the way up to infinite dimensional high hyperversal. But then, that is all a quantity. Even if it's infinite, it is still a quantity. So if you are superior to quantities, therefore you should be outerversal. At least that's what the scaling meta goes with. This is problematic to me because you can be beyond infinite dimensional through a certain scaling method, but in doing so, are you really surpassing infinity? If I go with the idea of infinity plus one, you have surpassed infinity. You are beyond it. However, in terms of quantity, even though you've surpassed it, you can rearrange infinity, much like something demonstrated in this Vsauce video clip that I will be showing right now, where you can put the one back at the beginning. So even though you are beyond it, you're technically still bound by the same axiom. There is nothing separating you because there's nothing new to say this one should be here as opposed to somewhere else. And that separation is why I have a problem with quantitative superiority. But I will mention a different scaling method that uses a very similar logic to quantitative superiority, and one that's actually older than quantitative superiority that does this correctly, and how to actually define it. Now this next part is exactly what I was saying a moment ago. How to count past infinity while also being beyond it in a way that you can't just reorder the number of dimensional levels so much that you haven't really surpassed a quantity. And doing so in a way that makes sense and is scalable, as opposed to just saying a vague you are beyond a quantitative amount. Because being beyond a quantitative amount is something that you really won't see in fiction. And that is with two different scaling methods using ordinal arithmetic. The first one I want to show is ordinal dimensionality. If we go back to the example I showed on Vsauce, the reason why we could reorder these lines to say different dimensional levels and count that the +1 could actually just be reordered in the infinity itself was because we didn't introduce anything new. Conceptual transcendences, narrative transcendences, and being beyond dimensionality all revolve adding something new, a new axiom. And ordinal arithmetic can be that new axiom as well, even though it is still a quantity. And doing so, we simply add that dimensionality has to be ordered. Sounds weird, right? But if we say that there's an order type, and that this extra one past infinity has to be labeled as something past infinity, calling it something like omega, that is beyond anything that can be reached in dimensionality. If you were to simply add 1 to infinity, you are limited to the axiom that was originally established. Meanwhile, the ordinal dimensionality shows a dimension that cannot be reached through stacking through infinities. Therefore, this omega comes after any infinity beforehand. This is why we have ordinal arithmetic, to count after infinity. Now, this is a very rare case that you'll see in any sort of fictional power scaling, but it does exist. This ordinal dimensionality would automatically be outerversal. And if you start scaling through it, scaling to higher ordinals, you can start scaling to outerversal plus by stacking enough, or high outerversal if you stack enough ordinals. And a verse that does this, and blatantly shows it, is actually Marvel Comics, who don't just use ordinal arithmetic through omega, but keep going using Cantor's Alephs, going through the entire Aleph series, which is something even further than the ordinal arithmetic. The only problem with ordinal arithmetic, really, is just how uncommon it is. Most verses do not have this. The second problem that ordinal arithmetic has is some people think being transfinite is the same as having ordinal arithmetic. Technically speaking, this is not the case. You need to make sure that when you're being transfinite that it directly mentions ordinals, or something that is using ordinals, like Cantor's ordinals, or anything else that counts past infinity, properly. Simply saying transfinite arithmetic can very much mean the same as the infinity plus 1 problem that was already established. But while ordinal dimensionality, just going up to omega, automatically makes it outerversal, there is another way you can use ordinal arithmetic to reach outerversal, but it's much more complex. Now, the more complicated way of using ordinals to reach outerversal is ordinal number of high hyperversal realities. Confusing? Let me explain it. Let's say you have a bubble, and in this bubble you have smaller bubbles. These little bubbles are all three-dimensional universes. You might have seen it on some picture of a multiverse before. Now, even though all the material inside this bubble is three-dimensional, the fact that these universes aren't connected in any way in a three-dimensional way, that means the bigger bubble must be four-dimensional, because it is containing things that are beyond the three-dimensional scope. Now let's look a bit further out. Let's say each one of these bubbles are not three-dimensionals, but instead infinite-dimensional, high hyperversal if you will. If that's the case, how big is the big bubble? Well, the big bubble is still high hyperversal, and its dimensionality is the infinity plus 1 problem we've been talking about. But let's say we had a certain number of bubbles inside that big bubble. Not infinity, but an omega number. Remember, omega has to come after infinity and cannot be grouped with everything else. Because it can't be grouped with everything else, it must be in a different bubble. And if it's in a different bubble, it has to be one that's not reachable by the original bubble. So if we had an infinite number of high hyperversal realms inside one big bubble, and then another bubble with just a singular high hyperversal realm, that separate bubble can then be drawn a new bubble around everything, and that new bubble will be outerversal, because that new bubble is trying to bridge the gap between an ordinal that cannot be done. Complicated, right? Well, technically speaking, I have seen this scaling before, and I've mentioned it in a video before. Both types of ordinal scaling to reach outerversal, being an ordinal number of high hyperversal realms, as well as an ordinal number of dimensionality, exists inside SCP-4555. So as it's very uncommon, this is another way you can reach outerversal. Now let's talk about outerversal scaling methods I've used before, starting with probably the most common one on the channel, Metaphysical. Remember we said before that we're saying that concepts were outerversal? Well, a generalized way of talking about things that are conceptual is to talk about something that is metaphysical. If you are metaphysical, you are meta of the physical, or in other words, you are describing the physical with your physical properties. Think of like if someone is metaphysical, they're sort of the physics of physics, which makes them beyond physics, because you're describing descriptors. Because of such, they are non-physical properties and cannot be bound by something like space or time, because they are descriptions of those very aspects. So therefore, metaphysical objects are conceptual most of the time, and also they would be outerversal. However, this comes with some problems, especially with how it's used in fiction. Very much times in fiction, when they're talking about something that is incorporeal, which is something that's non-physical because it's non-physical, let's say a spirit, a ghost, or something like that, they will say they're metaphysical, which is incorrect. Something that is metaphysical needs to describe the physical. Let's explain something I mentioned in the previous video, being my 9 types of multiverse video, and that being the 7th type of multiverse, the holographic multiverse. Now the holographic multiverse I described in that video much like the Platonic concepts. Instead of saying that you have the non-existent shadow being all of reality up to infinite dimensional high hyperversal, we said that the hologram was a projection of non-existent fiction up to infinite dimensionality high hyperversal, and that the real outside of it would therefore be outerversal. Now in a debunk posted on Versus Battle Wiki on my video made by the Ultimate God 4, who doesn't seem to debunk most of the video but instead actually just make comments about other people's scaling, not even my own, he mentioned how in Brian Greene's wording, they actually mention it more like if the holographic multiverse was actually like fiction on a page and the people watching were only 3-dimensional. Now, while this is true, that is the wording Brian Greene was going for, it doesn't reflect what the 9 types of multiverses do, because as you go higher in number, they get bigger. So assuming that the holographic multiverse is only 3-dimensional goes against what the entire point of the book is. And that's not even the principles of how the holographic multiverse works. And they tried to mention some of that to say that it should be a 4th-dimensional shape casting a non-existent shadow, but that's not correct either. So what is the correct way of scaling the holographic multiverse? Not the simplified way I've mentioned just moments ago, but the way it is actually defined in physics. This will be more complicated, so if you don't like it, feel free to skip this part of the video. Now, to make sure that I'm reading these correctly, I will be using AI to read out 2 different quotes describing parts of the holographic principle.
The holographic principle states that the entropy of ordinary mass, not just black holes, is also proportional to surface area and not volume. That volume itself is illusory and the universe is really a hologram which is isomorphic to the information inscribed on the surface of its boundary. Operating way out on the boundary of a universe with the specific shape schematically illustrated in Figure 9.5, this quantum field theory embodies all physical features, processes, and interactions of strings that move within the interior, a link made explicit through the dictionary translating phenomena between the two. And since we have a sure-footed mathematical definition of the boundary quantum field theory, we can use it as a mathematical definition of string theory, at least for strings moving within this spacetime shape. The holographic parallel universes may thus be more than a potential outgrowth of fundamental laws. They may be part of the very definition of the fundamental laws.
Now that you've heard both of the definitions word for word, and I have not tried to entangle anything, let me explain. You see, when it comes to the holographic multiverse, what it's actually doing is using pre-existing physics models such as string theory, brain theory, and things like that. And when they're doing it, they're saying that these physical properties can actually all be mapped to the universe from a two-dimensional plane. And mapping from the two-dimensional universe up to everything else is a hologram. So essentially the universe is a hologram because it's being projected from this two-dimensional plane. However, we can then scale that further because everything that's being projected is the definition of the physics itself. In the two descriptions I've just read out to you, in the first one from Brian Greene's book, we can very clearly see that the holographic multiverse holograms, what's being projected, is the very fundamental laws themselves. And if you are defining the laws, you are metaphysical. You are describing the physics itself. Furthermore, if you look at the other one, which just simply comes from Wikipedia, you can go and read it up, you can very much see that what is considered the hologram is the illusionary universe. It is what is projected. Meanwhile, what is coming from the actual location where the two-dimensional plane is projecting from would be then considered the reality. The only difference between this and something what I described in my previous video is in the holographic multiverse, no one actually lives where the holograms exist. The multiverse is at an outerversal level because it has something metaphysical projecting the physics itself, but no one lives there because it's not something like Platonic concepts where we have something that exists there. That's the main difference. But otherwise, the holographic multiverse is outerversal. The only reason why you wouldn't use it probably too much in scaling is it very rarely will pop up. Now let's explain probably a different version of outerversal scaling that you might have heard before on the channel if you see my Type 4 multiverse videos, and that is external reality hypothesis. Now, external reality hypothesis is actually just a fancy way of saying something that is beyond the physical world. In other words, we're trying to say that there is something outside the physical world that is not bound by anything within it, and in physics, something like the Type 4 multiverse uses this idea to say that there is something outside the physical world that describes the physical, something that is metaphysical and just represents everything inside of it. This is essentially just as vague as character stats and profiles beyond dimensionality, because all I'm saying is it's an external reality that is beyond all dimensionality. Therefore, external reality hypothesis would be outerversal. And it's really only used when using definitions for something higher up. Interestingly though, because its definition that is something that is beyond what currently exists in creation itself, something that is known, it does mean its definition and size can actually change depending on the size of the multiverse in question. For example, if you were to have a multiverse that is not got any higher dimensionality, so it doesn't have 4-dimensional, 5th-dimensional, etc., external reality hypothesis can just be higher dimensionality because it doesn't already exist. If we did have high dimensionality all the way up to high hyperversal, and then we have external reality hypothesis, it is then outerversal. If we scaled external reality hypothesis on a fictional multiverse that already had something that was outerversal, well then it has to be something that's beyond what can be currently defined inside of it. This means if you had a multiverse that had an outerversal realm in it, the next external reality hypothesis would very much likely be something like high outerversal. If you remember, the definition of high outerversal is to surpass outerversal as outerversal has surpassed everything below it. Therefore, high outerversal would just be a second external reality hypothesis. And if you had an infinite number of external reality hypotheses from an outerversal realm, you would reach extraversal, which is the highest tier on character stats and profile. For the final one I'm going to mention in this video, and in fact it is the biggest, and that is an axiomatic transcendence. An axiomatic transcendence is basically you surpass an axiom. Now, what is an axiom? An axiom, I like to describe it as a line of logic. For example, you could say that when we were introducing dimensionality on an infinite three-dimensional universe so that we could reach high hyperversal, we were introducing the axiom of dimensionality. When we were saying we were adding conceptuality to reach outerversal, we were adding a new axiom. If we added narratives instead, that would be a different axiom. If we added external reality hypothesis, something that is able to stack itself over and over to reach higher and higher, that is also a new axiom. We can also say numbers themselves, the levels 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to infinity. That is its own axiom, and so are ordinals. So the reason why axiomatic transcendences can reach outerversal is because if we have a universe that is high hyperversal, anything we do to try and get it to outerversal would inherently be an axiomatic transcendence. However, what makes axiomatic transcendences so large is, if you think about it, let's say we added conceptuality to make something be outerversal. We've added one axiom. Now, if we want to add another axiomatic transcendence, we need to go higher without using things that already exist. But if you have something like the concept of concepts, something I mentioned earlier in the video, you can reach high outerversal just by discovering that. And you can keep stacking concept of concept of concept to reach another level of outerversal far beyond high outerversal. And if you do that an infinite number of times, you can reach extraversal. Which then means if you have an axiomatic transcendence on an already outerversal realm, you can reach extraversal simply because of the fact that the axiom of outerversal can extend all the way to extraversal. Remember, extraversal is defined using outerversal. So if we had an axiomatic transcendence that reached outerversal, a second axiomatic transcendence reaches extraversal. Now I just said if we stack concept of concept of concept, we are using the same axiom. We're using the conceptual axiom. And thus we can reach extraversal just by stacking one axiom after already being outerversal. Now, imagine you already had infinite possibilities within your multiverse. Therefore, you can infinitely stack the outerversal transcendences, all because it's already defined as a pre-existing axiom. This is something that actually happens in a Type 4 multiverse. A Type 4 multiverse uses axiomatic transcendences of everything that previously exists in a mathematical way. I like to use this diagram where they show different things in physics and say that these are different axioms that we're using when describing a Type 4 multiverse, and then I'd like to use the quote next to it that Tomark has saying the real diagram would be an infinite number of axioms. So you have an infinite number of axioms. We're just using the axiom of infinite dimensions, something that exists in a Type 3 multiverse, as well as external reality hypothesis, can already reach extraversal. So imagine an infinite number of axioms, and that is the level of a Type 4 multiverse. Now that's the end of the different versions of outerversal scaling that I can come up with. Did I miss any? Comment down below. I'm bound to miss some, and I bet some of you are more creative than me and can come up with different ways of reaching outerversal. There's probably many different ways that are much more interesting than some of the ones I've come up because they're a bit too complicated. Comment down below at your suggestions and comment down below what the next video should be. Check, check. Thank you all for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video going over outerversal scaling, you'll probably like something like my 9 types of multiverse video, where I go from the very weakest multiverse level, which isn't even an infinite multiverse, and going all the way up to a Type 4 multiverse. Of course, in that video I explain things and show things differently to this one, so whichever way you prefer, you can enjoy. You might also enjoy my Platonic Concepts video, because that was one of my oldest ones back when I didn't even speak. I used an AI voice back in the day. There's also different people in the description of this video who do their own power scaling videos. Check them all out. And with that, thank you all for watching, have a good day.